It was a cold, rainy afternoon when Maya Jones stepped into the noisy police station. She wore a plain hoodie and a pair of worn-out jeans. Her hair was damp from the rain, and she carried no fancy purse or bag, just a small notebook tucked under her arm. At first glance, she seemed like an ordinary person, someone who might be there to ask for directions or pay a parking ticket. But Maya was not ordinary, not even close. The station was busy. Phones rang non-stop, officers hurried from one desk to another, and the sound of chatter and footsteps filled the air. Maya stood quietly near the entrance, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't move much, didn't speak to anyone. She just waited, calm and patient. A few officers noticed her standing there. They didn't know who she was, and they didn't bother to ask. Instead, they whispered to one another. One officer, a tall man with a shiny badge, chuckled and shook his head. Another leaned in to say something, and both smirked as they glanced at Maya. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," one officer muttered loud enough for others to hear. A few chuckled. Maya heard them, but her face didn't change. She stayed calm. Her hands rested by her sides, her eyes steady. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to explain herself. She had come for something much bigger, something that none of them could have guessed. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but inside the station, Maya stayed still. She noticed the small details. The cluttered desks, the way some officers laughed loudly, ignoring the people waiting for help. She noticed the posters on the walls, talking about respect and honor, though some people here didn't seem to follow those words. What the officers didn't realize was that Maya was no ordinary visitor. She hadn't walked in because she was lost, and she wasn't there to file a report. Maya had a purpose, a very important one. And though she stood quietly now, it wouldn't stay that way for long. Each minute she stood there, unnoticed and underestimated, the officers unknowingly gave her what she needed, a closer look at how things worked in this place. And as they laughed and whispered, Maya's calm gaze never wavered. The truth was, Maya was here for something that could change everything. The people in the room didn't know it yet, but their lives were about to be shaken in ways they couldn't imagine. Maya wasn't just anyone, and soon, they would see. For now, though, she waited silent, still, and completely unnoticed. But not for long. Sergeant Reynolds was the kind of man who liked being in charge. His voice was loud, and he made sure everyone heard him whenever he spoke. The moment he saw Maya standing near the entrance, quiet and still, something in him sparked. He didn't know her, but he didn't like what he saw. "Hey," he shouted, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the busy station. "You can't just stand there blocking the way." Heads turned to look at Maya, but she didn't react much. She simply took a small step to the side, her face calm and quiet. That should have been the end of it, but Reynolds wasn't done. He narrowed his eyes at her and walked closer. "You think you can just come in here and do whatever you want," he barked. His words were sharp, filled with anger and something worse, disdain. The room grew quieter. People stopped what they were doing to watch. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one said a word. Other officers exchanged quick glances, unsure if they should step in. But they didn't. Maya still didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there, looking straight ahead, calm as ever. Her silence seemed to bother Reynolds even more. "What's the matter?" he sneered, leaning slightly toward her. "Do you even understand English?" His words were meant to insult, to make her feel small. The room was so silent now you could almost hear the raindrops outside. Maya slowly lifted her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was steady, strong, and unshaken. There was no fear in her expression, no anger either. It was as if she was looking through him, like she was waiting for something. Reynolds stepped even closer, towering over her. "I'm talking to you," he growled, his face inches from hers. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't take a step back. She stood as still as a tree in the wind, her calmness like a mirror reflecting his anger right back at him. The officers watching from their desks shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered, "Should we say something?" "Nah, let it go," another mumbled. "She's not saying anything. She'll probably leave soon." But Maya didn't leave. She stayed, quiet and composed, her eyes never leaving Reynolds. The tension in the room was thick, like a rope pulled too tight, ready to snap. Reynolds didn't know it, but every word he spat, every step he took toward her, was only making things worse for himself. Maya's silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. It was something far stronger: control. And though Reynolds didn't see it yet, the calm before a storm is always the quietest. For now, the room stayed frozen, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Everyone wondered the same thing: who was this woman, and why wasn't she afraid? The air in the station felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. Sergeant Reynolds couldn't stop himself. His anger grew with every second Maya stood there, calm and quiet. To him, it was as if she was ignoring him, and that made him furious. He started muttering under his breath, but not so quietly that people couldn't hear. "People like her think they can do whatever they want. No respect. No manners." Maya didn't move. She didn't even blink. It was as if his words didn't touch her at all. Reynolds took another step toward her. His voice was louder now. "You think you're so special? You think you don't have to follow the rules?" The other officers were watching closely now. Some looked uneasy, shifting in their seats. Others stayed frozen, unsure of what to do. Maya still didn't say a word. She stood there like a statue, her expression calm and steady. Her silence wasn't weak, it was strong, and that strength only made Reynolds angrier. Then, without warning, he did something no one expected. Reynolds shoved her. The room gasped in unison. The sound of his hand pushing against her shoulder seemed to echo. Maya stumbled back a step, but she didn't fall. She regained her balance as if it were nothing. Reynolds pointed a finger at her. "You don't just stand there like you own the place," he shouted. "You don't put your hands on me." Maya finally moved. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his. Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. It wasn't a happy smile. It was something else, something that made people stop and stare. The room grew even quieter. The officers glanced at each other, their faces filled with doubt and confusion. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how someone was supposed to react. One officer leaned over to whisper to his colleague. "Is it just me, or does she seem different?" "Yeah," the other replied, his voice shaky. "Something's not right here." Reynolds didn't seem to notice the change in the room. He was too caught up in his own anger. "I'm talking to you," he barked. "Don't just stand there looking at me." But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just stood tall, her gaze steady. It was clear now she wasn't afraid of Reynolds. She wasn't afraid of anyone. The officers began to whisper among themselves. "Who is she?" one asked. "I don't know," another replied. "But I think we're about to find out." The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Everyone could feel it. Something big was about to happen, and they couldn't look away. The moment everything changed came suddenly, like a lightning bolt in a dark sky. Sergeant Reynolds was still yelling, his voice echoing through the room. His words were sharp and angry, but Maya didn't respond. She stood as calm as ever, her eyes steady on him. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like no one dared to breathe. Then, a new voice broke through the noise. It was firm and commanding, and it came from the other side of the room. "Sergeant Reynolds, stand down." Everyone turned their heads to see Chief Inspector Calloway entering the station. He walked quickly, his face pale and serious. His eyes immediately found Maya, and as soon as he saw her, his whole expression changed. "Maya," he said, his voice trembling slightly. But then he corrected himself, speaking more formally. "Dr. Jones, I had no idea you would be visiting us today." The room went completely silent. Every officer stared in surprise, their mouths slightly open. "Dr. Jones." They couldn't believe what they had just heard. Maya stepped forward, her movements calm and purposeful. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek badge. She held it up for everyone to see. The words Federal Oversight Committee shone brightly, engraved in gold. The room stayed frozen for a moment. Then, slowly, all eyes turned to Reynolds. Reynolds' face went pale, his tough and angry expression melting away. He opened his mouth to speak but no words came out. He looked from the badge to Maya and back again, trying to process what was happening. "Wait," he finally managed to say, his voice weak. "You're—" "Yes," Maya said, her voice steady and strong. "I'm Dr. Maya Jones, and I'm here to evaluate the station. And from what I've seen so far, it's failing miserably." Reynolds took a step back, his hands shaking slightly. All the confidence and power he had shown earlier were gone. He looked around the room, as if searching for someone to help him, but no one moved. The other officers were too shocked or maybe too relieved to do anything. Chief Inspector Calloway cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Dr. Jones, I assure you, we take your visit very seriously. This behavior does not reflect how we usually operate." Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "Doesn't it?" she asked calmly. Her words were quiet, but they carried a weight that made everyone pause. Calloway swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. We'll make sure everything is reviewed," he said quickly. "Starting with Sergeant Reynolds." Reynolds' face turned even paler. He tried to speak again, but the words stuck in his throat. For the first time, he seemed to realize how badly he had messed up. Maya lowered her badge and placed it back in her pocket. She stood tall, her presence filling the room. "This isn't just about one person," she said, her voice firm. "This is about the culture of this entire station. And trust me, changes are coming." The officers looked at each other, their faces filled with unease. No one dared to speak. As the weight of her words settled over the room, Reynolds stood frozen, his world crashing down around him. Sergeant Reynolds' confidence vanished like a puff of smoke. His face turned pale, and his shoulders slumped. All the arrogance and anger he had shown earlier were gone. Now, he looked small and afraid. The other officers, who had been watching silently the whole time, began to shift uncomfortably. They looked at Reynolds with mixed expressions. Some seemed disgusted, others just looked nervous. None of them spoke. Chief Inspector Calloway took a step forward, his face stern. "Sergeant Reynolds," he said in a firm voice, "you are suspended immediately, pending an investigation into your behavior." Reynolds opened his mouth to protest, but Calloway raised a hand to stop him. "Not another word," he said sharply. "You've done enough damage already." Reynolds hung his head, his tough guy act completely gone. He didn't argue. He didn't fight back. Two officers walked up to him and gently but firmly took him by the arms. "Come on," one of them said quietly. As they led Reynolds toward the door, the room stayed completely silent. The man who had once filled the station with his loud, angry voice was now walking out in shame. Maya stood tall, her calm gaze sweeping over the room. She wasn't angry. She wasn't loud. But her presence filled the space like a powerful storm. "This isn't just about one person," Maya said, her voice steady and clear. "Sergeant Reynolds made bad choices, but he didn't act alone. This is about the culture in this station, the way you've allowed disrespect, prejudice, and bad behavior to go unchecked." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The officers shifted nervously, avoiding her gaze. They knew she was right. "That ends today," Maya continued. "From now on, things will be different. And I'll be watching to make sure they are." Chief Calloway nodded. "We'll start making changes immediately, Dr. Jones," he said. His voice sounded serious, almost desperate to show he understood the gravity of the situation. Maya didn't reply right away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small nod, as if to say, "We'll see." The officers who had laughed at Reynolds' jokes earlier now looked uneasy. Some of them glanced at Maya with what seemed like respect or maybe fear. They knew things would not be the same anymore. As Reynolds disappeared through the station doors, his head still hanging low, the room felt different. The once busy station was now quiet, the air heavy with the weight of accountability. Maya turned and walked toward the exit. Her steps were calm and measured, but her presence lingered, like the aftermath of a storm. She paused at the door and turned back, her voice ringing out one last time. "Change isn't easy," she said. "But it's necessary. Remember that." With those final words, she stepped out into the rainy afternoon, leaving the station behind, but the lessons she left would stay with them for a long, long time. Maya stood at the doorway, the rain outside casting a soft gray light into the station. She turned back one last time, her figure tall and steady, her presence calm but commanding. The room was silent, every officer still feeling the weight of her words and actions. She looked at them all, her eyes full of strength and something else, wisdom. Her voice, though not loud, carried across the room with ease. "Never judge someone by how they look or where they come from," she said. Her tone was steady, and her words felt as solid as stone. "The respect you give or deny can change everything." The officers shifted uncomfortably, some staring at the floor, others meeting her gaze with a newfound understanding. They knew she was right. Many of them had made the same mistake Reynolds had, though not as openly. It was a quiet lesson, but one they couldn't ignore. Maya's eyes softened for a moment as she added, "Respect isn't hard. It doesn't cost you anything. But the lack of it? That can destroy more than you think." She didn't stay to see their reactions. Her point had been made, her purpose fulfilled. She stepped outside into the rain, her steps confident and sure. The drops fell lightly on her hoodie, but she didn't rush or pull up her hood. It was as though she welcomed the rain, letting it wash away the tension of the day. Inside the station, the officers stayed quiet. The noise of ringing phones and shuffling papers that usually filled the air seemed to pause. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the faint sound of rain hitting the roof. Chief Inspector Calloway stood in the middle of the room, looking thoughtful. He turned to his team, his face serious but not harsh. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," he said. "What happened here today wasn't just about one mistake. It's about who we are and who we need to be." The officers nodded slowly. Some looked ashamed, others looked determined to do better. Meanwhile, outside, Maya walked down the wet street, the station fading behind her. She didn't need to look back. She knew she had made an impact. The weight of her responsibility was heavy, but she carried it with pride. She wasn't just one person making a statement, she was a force for change, and she knew it. As she disappeared into the distance, her words echoed in the minds of everyone who had heard them. Never judge someone by how they look or where they come from. It was a simple truth, but one that carried a power they wouldn't soon forget. The rain continued to fall, but inside, something had shifted. Respect, long ignored, now hung in the air like a fresh breeze, and the station would never be the same again.